Hi, Arcom. Can I confirm if that means the recording is good?
Yep, recording has started.
All right, so with that, we can formally start. Once again, congratulations everyone for reaching the open semifinals, debating on the motion, assuming feasibility. This House would allow the consensual transfer of suffering. We have DLSU B on government and ADMU B on opposition. To start this debate, calling on the Honorable Prime Minister. You're here.
Wow. Hi. Audible invisible. Sorry, I used my headband before I came here. Yeah? Audible invisible.
Yes.
Okay. POI's through voice. I can't believe I'm doing this. Like, I'll type it sa chat. It's through voice. Or you don't type it in chat so that I can hear. Also, there are instances that it's like my voice is louder than my computer. So just scream or open your camera. One must imagine Sisyphus happy, but one can also imagine Sisyphus rolling a smaller boulder up this hill. And that is exactly what government is standing for, the reduction of suffering when it is necessary and when these people can access it. What is the policy? There are three things. Number one, it will be facilitated by the state. And this is how we guarantee safety, and it will be regulated. The fact that there will be 5 things in this process. Number one, the first thing is that we can quantify their suffering. That means that these people, there will be a facility. We will call it the anti-suffering facility, and then people will go into it and then they will say, please quantify my suffering, and then the people there will say, okay. Then the therapist will ask you how much suffering you want to remove from your life, and then that's how much suffering we will remove. But also we would put a cap on the amount of suffering that we can remove at a single amount of time, which means that under our side people can't just remove all of their suffering and then their life can be better. We will do this gradually because obviously that will cause massive amounts of mental harm to you. But also we would include contracts, informed consent, an object, all of the things that make you allow like informed consent on all of the metrics for it. The fact that you have enough information to know about it, the fact that your therapist talked to you about it, the fact that you read the consent forms means that these are all consensual. But also the transfer will look like you will enter a chamber and then you will absorb all the suffering in the world, and then when you enter the chamber, you don't have the suffering in the world. But we would also posit that we will not monetize this. This is very important because we have to say that is true. The second thing about this policy is who is suffering or who is willing to suffer. Who are the people who are going to take this on? 4 things. Number one, it's probably people who are more likely to consent to these, like your family and friends who you currently already kind of give like your suffering to when you talk to them about your lives. But we think this is a more direct and tangible way to be able to reduce your suffering under our side. Number two, social movements, the people who care about, for example, the poor or the ethnic minorities. These are people who might be willing to be able to take on suffering for you because these are their personal advocacies. Number three, if you're lonely and you don't really have friends and nobody cares about you, then we think that this will look like a donation bank where donors are matched with people who need organs, which means that these facilities will match you with a person who is willing to take take a small amount of that suffering against you, and then that's distributed against a lot of people. But fourthly, we think that this can have a time lag. You can loan your suffering. You put your suffering in a battery and in the future, or in somebody else, and then in the future when you are more stable, that is when you take back your suffering because you are more likely to be able to fix it under your side or like able to deal with it. Yeah, I'll take the PY.
If you've given up your suffering, why on earth will you want to take it back? Why will anybody voluntarily take in suffering for a stranger?
Okay. Do you have friends? Like, I assume that you talk to your friends because, like, perhaps they have troubles. So, because you are listening to your friends, people already consent towards having some suffering in their lives. We think that if it is consensual and people have rationalized about it, it's okay. So, first argument, why do we think this is principally just, regardless of the outcome? Number one, we think it is the state's interest. It is in the social contract to make people's quality of lives better. Because the worldview under our side is that people were put into this world without their consent. People have birth lottery, where in the evil in this world is a worldwide problem, and if there is a way to be able to solve it, we must do everything to prevent it. Which is why opposition actively harms people, because they push this suffering upon these people when they know that there could be a solution to this. What are instances of this in real life? We think that the criminal justice system puts reparations against other people to reduce their suffering, even at the expense of other people's suffering. So perhaps these people, we always like try to remove suffering from one person and then move it to another person in terms of reparations. We've done this with people, for example, in African Americans in the United States, or for example, giving conditional cash transfers towards women in their labor. But number two, we do this all the time in terms of welfare. Like, for example, the fact that people were born into socio-economic status that they did not choose in, and that's why the state has to step in to be able to give them the types of things that they need, because they otherwise could not have accessed it. What is the application to this argument? The fact that people, you can choose the fact that people at the very least can choose the amounts of suffering that they want is something that is important, because I cannot choose to move out of being an ethnic minority. I cannot choose to move out of being a Filipino. But what I can choose under our world is to be happier about it, to feel less shitty about it. And we think that is particularly important for the reason that suffering is incredibly personal. Any other argument coming from opposition or alternative is something that is likely to be applied blanketly, and your friends cannot even do this to the same extent under our side, which means that this is an exclusive benefit principally and pragmatically. Second argument, what is the urgency? This offsets the crime of birth lottery. The problem in status quo is that people are born in lives of suffering, and we did not choose to be born. We did not choose to suffer. Why is this worse under opposition? The first reason is because all other alternatives have failed. Therapy have become significantly inaccessible because of the amount of money that you need to be able to do it. Number two, medication makes you feel like you're a shell of yourself. The trade-off that you have to take because of the money as well that you need to pay for it. Drugs and just ignoring your problems is a very short-term band-aid solution. Or just escaping poverty is incredibly difficult, and if opposition tries to crystal ball this, I just don't know how they're gonna do this, because governments under our side will also try to solve poverty either way. But the second reason why this is worse under opposition is because absent the technology to transfer suffering, we think that you should have chosen a better POI if you're gonna raise it twice. So suffering is the reason why people don't get better. The fact that on a macro scale, learned helplessness makes people like stay in the same mentality all the time, which means that they're less likely to move out of their socio-economic status. The fact that depressed people coop themselves up in their room because they could not move out of their mental situations. What is our solution, therefore? The reason why government is incredibly important in this debate is because we are the prerequisite for any other alternative to be able to be effective. The first reason is because it is the prerequisite to move out of the suffering, that is to reduce it, so that you can mobilize yourself to imagine a world that is better. And that is why, for example, in marginalized communities, when they cannot imagine a world that is better, they usually stay within those communities. They stay within those communities. They just become people or tambais when they could have become teachers, because they could not imagine any other thing outside of that. We think that removing the suffering creates that allowance for your brain to be able to imagine, to be positive, to be optimistic. That source of imagination is something that we think is incredibly empowering for the individual, for you to mobilize them and for you to move them. But secondly, we think that all other alternatives are contingent on this policy to be able to become more effective. Note how therapists take years for a breakthrough with their clients. Once you remove the suffering, those years become like months. Those months become weeks. We think that therapists become significantly become easier to be able to do their job under our paradigm if people will still access this. But the important clarification here is that this is merely a tool in the toolbox. The fact that not everybody is going to consent to this all of the time or do this all of the time, because they obviously know that there are other things that they have to deal with, and they also have other alternatives like friends, means that these are things that we can also do. But lastly, note that poverty, doing this is significantly easier than moving out of poverty, but for the simple fact that under our side, it's also easier to move out of poverty once you can think clearly and once you can act clearly, means that this is a tangible benefit towards your capacity to make personal momentous decisions. For all of these reasons, government is incredibly proud to propose.
Here.
All right, thank you for that, Prime Minister. To open the case for side opposition, calling on the Leader of Opposition. Here.
Hi, am I audible and visible?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. POIs through chat, please. I will also type it so people don't forget. Okay. what is suffering? And I think that's a problem with government insofar as they don't really answer that. We would suggest that exists in gradients, that in the perception of someone, whether it be the feeling of guilt or the visceral feeling of disgust, these are all things that fall under the idea of what suffering can be for an individual, insofar as our metric for suffering is whether or not people are happy in their situations and how things can immediately take that away. And what this therefore means is that it's not just about people who are poor or people who are minorities therefore feeling suffering, but it also looks like rich people who are privileged, having their own version of suffering that they also want to be free of. And oftentimes that form of suffering is things like guilt, is things like feeling as if you're not doing enough for the world, and therefore being able to remove it removes any incentive for you to want to do good for other people. I want to be clear about what the process looks like on government. One, it is immediate shock upon receipt for the people who have to therefore receive it. Two, it looks like suffering and developing coping mechanisms that often develop over time, not being part and parcel with the suffering feeling you get at the first place. But third, that this is often additive to the own suffering that you already experience day to day. I want to deal with the ridiculous model of government, and I want to point out three things. One, they don't have fiat to assume it can only happen in the way that they say, because one, the extent of their fiat is that it can be done, not how. They have to prove why that's likely to be the case. Two, even if there are public incentives from the state, there are also private incentives to monetize this, and naturally, politicians are also present businessmen, so clearly there's something there. But third, the state just cannot facilitate this because they will have to spend millions, if not billions, on this kind of thing if you want to unlock the maximized benefit of government. But secondly, we would like to point out that this is about a transfer, which therefore presupposes you have to transfer it from one individual to another. But third, why on earth would the state spend money transferring trauma if they can just spend the money preventing the trauma in the first place? I am unclear as to why this ought to be the priority in comparison to one, doing things like affirmative action for the people that they claim suffer. Two, giving welfare for the poor who just cannot afford things that they need. But more importantly, likely if you believe their model and the full benefits of everyone's suffering being redistributed, the state would have to reallocate funds from equivalent forms of welfare. Finally, they say they're going to take your suffering away and then redistribute it. I want you to vibe check this, right? Do you know how politically unpopular it is for the state to say, we'll remove all your suffering and then give it back to you? What this means, therefore, is even if people have on aggregate less suffering because they had experienced full liberation and the state is therefore still giving back some degrees of pain, states will still not want to do this because generally it is quite unpopular. First argument then, why this is worse for the most vulnerable individuals. And I want to first ask, what does consent really mean and what connotes consensual transactions? One, consent presumes a yes from both parties. Like we agree, you can't siphon this from someone illegally, but what's within the realms of this debate is unreliable factors that lead to poor people saying yes. Two, the feasibility only exists insofar as the transfer can happen, but not that people can have perfect information and consent. But third, perfect consent doesn't actually exist because one, people are informed by their personal lived experiences and what capitalism tells you to do, meaning that we are never truly free. But two, the only way to say there's consent is for someone to therefore say yes, but you do not know what informed that decision. For example, we consider the choice to get married made from perfect consent, which is why it's backed by law, which is why we allow them to, for example, sign the contracts. But even if they don't have perfect information on who they married or who their alternatives could have been, we still recognize that choice. So what's the first reason therefore this is worse for the most vulnerable? One, the most vulnerable people in the world are disproportionately going to take in suffering from others. Three reasons. One, economic disadvantage predisposes them to select jobs and opportunities that inherently hurt them, such as signing up for clinical trials or working in mines. This is something that is connected to that, which means this is important because this explains why the literal background that they have, regardless of any pressure, is what convinces them to say yes, whether it's to richer friends or to other people. But second, even if it's not about economics, it is social hardships that they endure in life, where they are more likely to discount suffering at the decision point because they believe they can therefore get profit from it. But third, redistribution is just inherently unlikely because the state won't want to facilitate this because it's just a massively politically unpopular decision to more privileged individuals versus status quo like welfare. The impacts on the most vulnerable are quite simple. One, you have a race to the bottom because assuming the best case that this becomes a market and is regulated, there is still a lot of the most vulnerable people opting coming in. But second, this is a one and done and therefore impacts their long-term success and happiness as a vulnerable. What the PM says is suffering doesn't make people better. We would say it's far worse if it wasn't your original suffering in the first place because you are not well equipped to deal with it. But second, they can't just say it's reversible because it's unclear why the individual who unloaded their suffering would want to take it back. But third, on suffering, upon this suffering, it's incredibly difficult to fulfill the good life and achieve success. Because if you take more depression, if you take more anxiety, if you take more PTSD, this inhibits your whole life without you having amalgamated any experience for you to deal or cope with these kinds of traumas. But finally, it cannot just be like a salary grade payment for continuing to suffer, because this debate is a transfer, so that is the inherent transaction, not a surrogate. Before I go on, yes.
Yeah, saying it's difficult is not an argument not to do this. We have principled and pragmatic arguments why this is why this is just. You cannot just say it's unlikely to be done well and then say that the motion is unjust.
Dude, I'm not done with my first argument. Listen first. Let's go. Let's explain then the third thing, which is that poor people are unable to access coping mechanisms like therapy, where they can't even get a break, and note that this is additive to all these sufferings they have. So what does it therefore look like on their world? You have poor people who already suffer, who are inherently compelled to keep going and take on these kinds of things because they are likely to get fair compensation in the world that is likely to be constructed, and therefore means that you inherently disadvantage them. I want to explain, therefore, the second level of this, which is on rich people. What brings them to donate and contribute? We would suggest the primary moral motivator of rich people is the feeling that you aren't doing enough and the feeling of guilt that they have millions while people across the world suffer. The consequent suffering they feel is a representation of their humanity because they don't have any other form of suffering that they can hold on to. And when they have the ability to skip that by selling it off to somebody else, then that just simply won't happen, which means you reduce, for example, the extent to which they are willing to do things that actually change the world, and therefore they turn to things that are more accessory good things for tax breaks, like paying private schools even more, as opposed to making real impactful change because they do not need to satiate that guilt. But finally, why should you weigh this argument? One, if we allow this, we significantly fail our state obligation to the most vulnerable, because even if it's not poor people, it is socially disadvantaged people who will have their lives controlled in more vicious ways by others, which is why, for example, you have labor laws, because even if we recognize that people can make a decision to, for example, get paid less, to, for example, work in worse conditions, we recognize that people are inherently limited in comparison to the state in making these decisions. But second, we outweigh in the worst case of this debate, because our worst case is vulnerable people still existing, but there's a rising trend of the emerging middle class. And as we explained, the things you can do with this money are far better in our world in comparison to waiting for these people to amalgamate trauma before doing anything about it.
All right, thanks for that, LO. To continue the case for side government, calling on the Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
Hello, okay. Oh, I'll just get my timer. POS your voice. All right. All right. Again, POS your voice. Thank you to people for watching. Yeah. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think opposition tunnel visions to make this an economic debate or makes it too realistic, when realistically, this is a motion that is abstract. We have to look at this from a micro and macro perspective. So let's have some imagination here. I don't think a lot of the reasons that Nessie gives to prove to you that this is not something that will be done well are things that directly engage with the policy that we already told you. Because when they try to say that, oh, the state can't do this or that they can't fee up this motion, one, uncharitable, because allowing it literally means that the house is the state. So that means that we can regulate it. The same reason why the state can allow things like drugs, things like vices, but obviously we regulate it in real time. It's unclear why exactly this assertion of, oh, it's not going to be done well in this regard is something that you can buy or credit if they don't give any reasons as to why they're not like do this well. But the second thing is they're saying that it's going to be unpopular. Notice that this is an assertion just because they say that, oh, the idea of transferring suffering is not feasible to an average human mind. But obviously, at the point at which this motion happens, that is something feasible. And that's something that we say can be popular at the point at which suffering is something that everyone collectively experiences. So the point at which there is a new technology, for example, one machinery that is going to presumably be able to take your suffering, quantify it, and transfer it to another person, that is still seen to be something that can be obtainable as an average human being. We think that that's something that we can feel under our side. They can't just reassert that this is something that's unpopular. The last thing that I want to talk about is, oh, they say that the state will not be able to do this well because it's not like consensual things happen in status quo. They say that we're not actually free. Then the argumentation on their side is just that does not make choices at all. Because if they try to argue that every person has different reasons or different factors to make choices, then inevitably the state should ban everything and ban all free will. We don't think that this is enough to take down the fact that we can still verify and we can still have multiple alternatives to necessarily prove that consent is something that happens within these two individuals that will inevitably like make this transfer in the first place. So therefore, when they try to say that, oh, we're just going to prevent the trauma rather than making them go through it, I don't know what comparative is. Like, okay, social welfare. They say that they'll put like things into like therapy, but it's unclear why exactly this is something that's likely to be certain, but also exclusive, because we still also told you coming from Haduka that things like therapy are likely to be more effective when this transfer actually occurs in real time. So we think, therefore, a lot of the framing that comes from their first speaker is unclear why it's something that can be true, but most of it is asserted. The second thing that I want to do is, when do people actually consider transferring? Because they try to make it seem as if only rich people will often do these things. Note that even under this frame that rich people will be the only ones doing this, I don't exactly see the real urgency here, because rich people still inevitably suffer less than an average poor person. So at most, the rich sufferer is likely to have this amount of guilt, this amount of suffering because, oh, I can't buy my Louis Vuitton. Like, if you are able to transfer that, that's not going to be like extremely urgent on their side, even at the point at which it's transferred to a poor person. So we don't understand the clear urgency if rich people are the ones that are mainly doing this. It's unclear why exactly this is something that's mainly to be justified to not allow this happening. But at the point at which we told you that it's about urgency because people are like to have no alternatives, it's because people right now have the experiences where suffering is something that's unbearable. That means that we have multiple reasons why people would want to go through suffering anyway. So for example, the narrative that there's no gain with no pain, you have to learn more in order to learn more, you have to go through suffering, or that some suffering makes wins more valuable and fulfilling. These are narratives that make you incentivized to keep that suffering within yourself. So it means that the likely people that will be going to these transfers or these facilities are people that have unbearable amounts of suffering. So that means that they have no alternatives, because they already went through all of the other options that exist in status quo. That means that the people who will likely opt into this or who will actually go into these facilities are people that are the most vulnerable actor. Therefore, there has to be an option, or there has to be an ability for the state to provide welfare, because obviously the ones existing in status quo does not exist for them. So that means that you have to agree as well that the framing that we give you very specifically is that this does happen to an extent in status quo already. Because conceptually, suffering is something you already take upon with things like making relationships. When you choose to care about someone, when you take a role in the family, when you choose to love someone, you know that inevitably this relationship can cause you suffering, because you're also making another person in your life like your worry, or the fact that you're caring about someone that can also be under certain circumstances where you cannot control. So at the very least, when you do have relationships, and if you believe that social beings are human beings, then you have to agree that there will also be likely people that will take upon the suffering at the inevitably. Sure, PI.
Is there a significant difference from telling my friend about the assault that happened to me and actually having them experience the assault, experience the trauma, experience the fear that I felt in that moment?
Honestly, first of all, that suffering can also be quantified at the point at which you only like transfer some of it. You're not going to take the whole assault onto another person and say that, oh, this is something that I don't want to feel right now. But even then, like, as a person that will likely receive this news, you do suffer because you care about this person. And at the point at which you're going to be hearing these horrible things about this person, you're also going to feel that suffering, that shame, that guilt, that this likely transfer will also occur anyway. We think, therefore, that when people will volunteer to receive this suffering, it's because humans are empathetic. When parents already do this, that friends care for you, communities within religious and ethnic minorities, that even strangers do things to sacrifice their own time and resources to help people. If you believe that we are in a society, then you have to believe that this is true. Because even at the point at which you don't believe it, the policy mitigates this. Because at the point at which people are altruistic in nature, that donation banks are still something that people opt into, even if they know they have little resources, or at the very least, they just want to have the principal obligation of giving back to their community. These are things that they can do inevitably. So in the worst case, that on opposition, they're going to say that these are things that suffer, that these are things that are likely to be exploited or abused against. This is something that we already told you are things that can be regulated by the state. They have to prove exactly why exactly the exploitation abuse case is something likely to occur on their side. But at the point at which we told you that a lot of these there are a lot of public state incentives for them to be able to regulate this well, but also in the facility in and of itself, because it's gradual, because it's incremental. We're not going to shock people into doing this, and we're obviously not going to coerce and force people to be able to transfer their suffering at the point at which they just experience suffering in general. The people have incentives to take upon the suffering on themselves. So the people that do go and the people that will transfer are inevitably ones who have no other options and have no other alternatives. So at the very least, if you believe in Haduka's framing that this is something that's likely to occur in a world where therapy and welfare still exists, that means that it's much more effective when you do go and transfer these things, but also go into therapy after. That means that the margin of change that happens under our side is much larger. So if you want to believe that on scale, we just help more people because everyone suffers, so at the very least, we give them the choice at the point at which there are no alternatives, but also in uncertainty, we know that we can transfer these things and we know that people will actually receive them. With all of these reasons, propose.
All right, thanks for that, DPM. To continue the case for side opposition, calling on the Deputy Leader of Opposition. Here. Sorry, confirming if DLO is here.
Sorry about that. Am I audible and visible, I presume?
Yes.
PO is in chat. All right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I want to first point out in the speech the very dirty way in which the Sasao team tries to win this debate. They tried to win this debate on technicalities of the motion, but they misunderstand what even debating is about and what you can extend on fiat. The first response is, by the rules of debate, fiat happens with a realistic extent, which massively washes a lot of their impacts on perfect matching. Because let's say we implement a policy in a regular debate that this is how we do it anyways, right? As a state. This doesn't extend to controlling the incentives of actors and the way they do this. This doesn't extend to literally brainwashing people to absolutely care about this and to invent absolute protection mechanisms for people. It just implies the state will try to do it and can attempt to do it in regular society. Their state doesn't become a magic utopia that can regulate people's actions, have perfect matching, make everyone want to do this and to opt into this, and all of the people like sing kumbaya on their side. The extent they can fiat is to say it happens, it protects people and guarantees some degree of consent, but they cannot absolutely magically say consent is 100% guaranteed. You can sign the consent form, but it doesn't mean you know what happens when this happens. You can quantify and give a number, but everyone sees suffering and perceives suffering differently. Even this weak response from Lorene on public incentives doesn't explain what these public incentives are. By the way, check your flow. There's literally no structural reasons for why people will want to do this. When, as we explained coming from Nessie, many people often prioritize their own lives and often are unlikely to, especially if they are the privileged people that don't unduly experience suffering, will want to opt into this massive redistribution mechanism on their side of the house. If they want to have a utopia, they have to build it up from the ground and explain it. And they can't do it in this debate because it's far too late coming from WHIP, because this is simply not what you can claim in this debate. But secondly, even if we're charitable and say it does happen in their way, what does this even mean? If they say there's a bunch of people that suffer unduly and Your friends, for example, know that they have a large amount of quantity of suffering. I'm unclear as to why they will opt in. I'm unclear as to why they're going to take that massive amount of suffering if indeed that number is so high and if indeed there's such a significant personal cost to them. It's also unclear what this perfect matching thing is or how the state will do this redistribution on their side of the house to make it so that the amount of suffering is less. By the way, I'll point out later on, the amount of suffering is equal and can even be worse on their side. Let's engage on their principle on the state obligation, because this is a literal, only non-wishy-washy, non-nebulous claim that they have. The first thing they say is, this is good because the state can improve the quality of life of individuals in the same way it does for things like social welfare anyways. Firstly, I want to note you don't. Because in their best case, you remove suffering from a person. You don't remove the cause of that suffering. Many people will still, for example, go back to their abusive wife. Many of them, for example, will go back to their abusive workplace and still experience it more in the future. Compared to things like social welfare, which, by the way, if they say this is a mechanism that costs the state, is far better and more sustainable under our side of the house when we can do it, which is what our counterfactual explains. They had to explain why principally this is different. I would say it's far worse. But secondly, let's take the even if, right? I would flip this. It is actually increasing the suffering in the world when they have this massive redistribution or policy mechanism. Why? One, suffering is shaped by there are three structural reasons for this. One, suffering is shaped by personal experience. When you have it, so that you can only transfer suffering, but as Loreen concedes, not memory, not experience, it becomes random. It becomes meaningless. When there's no meaning attached to that suffering, when there's, for example, none of the love that you had for your person you broke up with, but only the suffering transferred onto someone else, it becomes random. In the same way that we, for example, think random attacks on people in their mental psyche is incredibly terrible and an intuition pump for this, it becomes a random thing that people are unlikely to, for example, find meaning in. And meaning is what blunts the pain. It blunts the sharpness of experience. On their side of the house, it's randomness that you're transferred to another individual, which makes it far, far worse. Number two, the experience of suffering is far worse because you cannot have the transfer of coping mechanisms for this. Even if you can quantify it and that's part of their fiat, it's again felt in different ways and dealt with in different ways. We have different ways we've cumulatively have dealt with the suffering in their lives. They don't transfer the coping mechanisms on their side. So people will deal with absolute unknown suffering on their side. They cannot say you could just magically see the image of the suffering. This is incredibly just bullshit, right? But thirdly, why is this likely to be bearable for people? Again, I want to note when you, for example, take the suffering of another person, and then let's say you're your friend, you will constantly feel as if you have to do it again. They will constantly feel as if you have to do it more. You will constantly feel as if you have to do it to other people. And then you become the person that's suffering. I want to be very clear why this is very, very important. For the most empathetic people, for the people that are good, who want to help other people, I want to know this debilitates them, this debilitates other people as well when you don't solve the causes of their structural problems, which means both parties are massively affected and the amount of suffering in the world is increased. So their side of the house can't just say redistribution, because when you redistribute, you increase the amount of suffering when people don't have meaning, when people don't have coping mechanisms, when people continue to take it more and more, when they feel, for example, subjected to this, the social pressure of this, which is why the amount of suffering in the world is greater. This is clearly a weighing metric for why Nancy's first argument clearly wins the debate. I'll then talk about social structures as the extension. Before I go into that, POI.
Yeah, removing the cause is such a nebulous argument under your side. How do you remove the cause being Filipino? How do you remove the cause being something that's given to you by the birth lottery? Obviously, you don't have a choice in status quo. That's why this is the last resort.
Again, your policy doesn't remove my race. You still have the cause of it. People still live in that country. They just have the brunt of that suffering removed, but they still go back into the structures. You don't fix things on your side. You make people experience it later, and far worse, when you, for example, put it to someone else who doesn't have the coping mechanisms for it. Extension. Why allowing suffering transfer weakens social structures that makes it far, far worse for states and far, far worse for societies? I want to note two crucial pieces of framing. One, it is the feeling that there are some people in this world that unduly feel suffering, but two, unduly feel suffering and cannot escape that suffering, like people who suffer from mental illness, like people who are poor and vulnerable. That is the social impetus for the rest of society, especially richer individuals, to say we need to care about healthcare, both for things like welfare and social society and policies, and care about mental health support and therapy. And note crucially, this is coming from people with capital giving it to people without capital, as per the argument coming from Nessie. Why does this get massively lessened on their side? First,
the poor are perceived and the vulnerable are perceived on taking suffering themselves, which means that if it is the case that they take suffering from themselves, they lose the massive moral anchor for the rest of society to say suffering is something they unduly have to experience, which is why we have to help them. If it's the case, you can indeed shift some of it. The perception is that it's no longer an important issue. People no longer have to care about it. But two, the state can shunt its obligation on their side. They can say, you just transfer bit-sized pieces of your suffering to other people, so we don't have to invest in these things. They can cut costs for this to do other politically popular things, not in welfare, not in mental health. This is very, very important because we solve the baseline of people. We ensure social welfare still exists. For their side of the house, the most vulnerable people lose that moral anchor for them to demand this because they can no longer say they are unduly experiencing suffering where everyone else is more advantaged. For those reasons, then oppose.
Thank you for that, DLO. To continue the case of side government, calling on government whip. Here.
All right, audible and visible.
Yes.
Perfect. Let me close the door, it's a bit cold. All right, Mezen, Gov Whip, he, him, verbal POIs to make it fun and interactive. And because this is a recorded round, I suggest you turn on your camera and, raise your hand. Just raise it once. Yeah, great. I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. You cannot fix the society that you are born into. You cannot fix the conditions that you are lulled into. These are things that you cannot change on either side of the house. But the most certain thing in this debate is how you can deal with suffering. And this is only guaranteed on government when you have this mechanism and you allow people to transfer suffering in the first place. This is where the debate exists. Opposition cannot also fix this, and they concede to this when they answer to our POI. But it's only on government where you get this best. I want to first deal with the bullshit coming from opposition about trying to argue against fiat. First, they say that, oh, people are going to be forced into this because of money. Poor people are going to be forced into this by the rich people. No, we said you cannot monetize this in our policy. Where the government, we can fiat this. Your argument doesn't work. Secondarily, they say that, it's going to be massively expensive. Therefore, we have to allocate our money elsewhere. I want to note, it's just a one-time, big-time cost. I don't understand why you have to constantly spend on this over time. Your opportunity or cost argument doesn't work. If anything, I don't even know why it's expensive. You don't prove why that's the case. Your opportunity cost argument falls. Third, they said we cannot do this well. There's no perfect consent. But there is some degree of consent in the world. People understand that undertaking suffering will feel bad in the first place. It's not a nebulous idea that an average individual cannot understand. I don't understand why people cannot consent into this to a reasonable degree. This is why there's informed consent even in the real world, even when it comes to medical procedures in the first place. Opposition is extremely uncharitable. It is not us. The dirty tactics exist on their side. I want to first deal with the social change extension coming from Jello, because note that this extension only works if he dealt with Haduka's analysis. What does Haduka tell you exactly under this? He tells you that people are unwilling to make change in the world because they feel a sense of learned helplessness. There's no impetus for them to want to change their conditions because they feel that their conditions are so bad and irreversible to the point at which these things can no longer be changed. So yes, maybe they have the moral high ground to say that we have to change the world, but there's no incentive on the ground for people to do this. Therefore, you cannot believe Jello's extension in the first place. We tell you that people in opposition are lulled into a state of learned helplessness, and the only op mechanism is the state giving social welfare programs. But this is irrelevant if there is no push from the recipients of these social welfare programs to do anything. What exactly changes on our side? First, when you decrease the magnitude of suffering, people finally see that the world is better and that there's something to work towards in the first place. This is where you create an incentive for the victims of suffering to want to change their conditions in the first place, and you get them out of that rut of learned helplessness, which is the prerequisite to Jello's extension. Secondarily, when you transfer this suffering to someone else, this is where you make people feel more empathetic and understand why that suffering is so bad in the first place, where you encourage allies and the people who you're transferring the suffering to understand why it is so important to change your condition in the first place. This proves two things in this debate. Firstly, we are the prerequisite to the extension of Jello, where you're able to change the conditions of people. But secondarily, this is where you create more clamor and social and critical mass for the people who want to change the world in the first place. Therefore, meaning that if we want to improve the condition of the world, it is far better on our side. It is far too late for WIP to respond to this because we already dealt with it from our first Nessie doesn't respond to it. Jello doesn't respond to it. It is far too late if it comes from Sam. It's going to be unengaging. The next thing I want to deal with then is this idea of poor people having to suffer more. I want to know if the only mechanism is money and maybe they owe something to rich people. This is very unlikely. If you're already suffering as a poor individual, as Nessie says, you have no incentive to take on more fucking suffering. This makes absolutely no sense. Just looking at it on an incentive basis. If it is money, we already framed this out. It completely doesn't work. So where exactly do we the best deal with suffering? Note that on either side, there are exogenous reasons as to why your suffering exists. In most cases, it is because of structures that you cannot change, whether it be depression or mental illness or what have you. On opposition, it is far worse off because the mechanisms for dealing with suffering are either inaccessible, uncertain, or indirect in the first place. Why exactly is our side better? Four key metrics for weighing. First, it is the most direct way to decrease suffering for an individual. On opposition, the mechanisms are roundabout, tedious, and difficult. For example, uplifting yourself from poverty is significantly difficult. I'm unsure as to why you're going to just get a job and suddenly you're away from poverty. It's indirect and it's uncertain. Secondarily, when you go into therapy, it takes a very long time to do this in the first place. The capacity for you to decrease your suffering just by going to therapy is significantly reduced because you have to find the right therapist. You have to get the right prescription. You have to understand that the therapy has to work on you. Versus on our side, it directly tackles your suffering. You just go into a fucking machine and it already decreases your suffering comparatively. Therefore, it's the most direct way to solve it. Secondarily, it is the most certain way to decrease suffering. All other alternatives are probabilistic at best. When you go into a job, you don't immediately decrease your suffering. When you go to therapy, you don't immediately decrease it. We are most certain, therefore we are far more preferable if this debate is about decreasing suffering, but also if it's about changing your condition, we already win that on social change. Third, on either side, your friends and family suffer because they deal with the weight of your abuse if you are a victim. But the difference now is that it is only on government that it gets transferred. On opposition, where a victim of abuse cries to their friends and your friends feel guilt and your family feels guilt because they feel the weight of your abuse, but they have no opportunity or chance to take that suffering away from you. So on that, more people are suffering on opposition. But the difference on government is that your friends and family can distribute the weight of that abuse and that suffering to your family and friends. Therefore, meaning two things. One, we have an opportunity for recourse in the first place versus an opposition where you have absolutely nothing. Second, the suffering now becomes far more manageable because you spread it out among multiple people. So in terms of where you deal with suffering best, it is in government because you distribute it, therefore it becomes far more manageable. What's a POI?
Suffering is greater even if you redistribute it because we explained that this is not your suffering within meaning and coping. You don't transfer as well structures or change it on your side of the house. You lose in that the push for that on your side when you can just say bit-sized pieces up, transfer suffering and not change the world.
This is stupid because you are taking suffering from your friend. You probably understand where the fuck this suffering comes from. You understand the context of this suffering. So if you understand that the weight of this suffering is directly tied to the abuse, directly tied to the societal structures that hurt them, you will then understand the meaning behind the suffering in the first place. Given that we framed this to you very clearly, you cannot say that this is devoid of the meaning in the first place. I think this creates further incentive to create societal change. You cannot keep pushing back against this and keep asserting your frame. This is uncharitable, as Ateneo likes to say in the first place. How should you then weigh this debate? The first thing is in terms of where we're best able to deal with suffering. It is very clearly in government because we tell you that the most certain way to do this is when you opt into this machine and you allow them to do this in the first place. You decrease the magnitude for suffering, therefore meaning that you're better able to deal with it because it's not as bad. The way to just visualize this and to imagine this is to say that if there are 5 people taking on the weight of one person as opposed to one person taking all that weight for themselves, it becomes far more manageable on our side. Therefore, the suffering dissipates over time versus for the single individual who is locked into that state forever because they're isolated and they feel like they're helpless and they have no mechanism to get out of it. The suffering is enduring on their side and there's no way to deal with it versus on our side, you distribute it and deal with it collectively. Secondarily, in terms of where we improve the conditions of the people, we clearly explain to you that the only mechanism to do this is to show people a better world by decreasing their suffering, and you only get this with the transfer. But more importantly, you create this incentive when you show people and you make them feel what the suffering is like in the first place, therefore creating the incentive for them to want to change the world in the first place. It is only on government where you deal with suffering best, but more importantly, create an opportunity for you to change the world. So if you want to change the world and you want to see a world absent suffering, you have to side with the proposition. For all of these reasons, propose.
All right, thanks for that, Gov Whip. To continue for side opposition, calling on opposition whip. Here.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes.
So I assume this round is recorded. And since my little sister just entered debating and her coach is on the other team, Gianna, if you're watching this video, I hope you get inspired by this debate and by my speech in the same way I was inspired by people who came before me. This is for you. Start in 3, 2, 1. This debate has been incredibly muddled because of government's inability to frame this debate. So the first thing I want to do is clarify the burden. On fiat, I'd point out that much of their case relies on a uniquely uncharitable explanation of how this motion operates. The reason we like saying it is because when we're against you, we have to say it. Note the extent of fiat is that you allow this transfer to happen. Look at the motion. It isn't that you will do it, it's that you allow it to do it, allow it to happen. You legalize it. You allow for this mechanism to exist in the first place. What that means is that the extent of fiat actually sways towards our side. Importantly, we prove this down the bench with all of the reasons you get from Nessie, that oftentimes politicians have intrinsic incentives to want to expand this to the private market, private incentives to want to lobby this and ensure that it is monetized. But crucially, we engage with their interpretation of the emotion and they ignore ours, indicating that there's already an express preference for them to want to force their unique perception of the world. One, all of our mechanisms apply regardless. Maybe it won't be monetized on their best case, but it's things like the leverage of your bosses that force you to want to do this. They even concede that you don't have perfect consent, which is why even in this world, it's still likely that sorts of things like this is likely to happen. But second, they claim to be protectors of agency, but defend the state redistributing the suffering to random people, which is arguably a larger moral failing on behalf of the state. But importantly, we explained from Jello that it simply isn't sustainable. You don't remove the source of that suffering. If it is true that people turn to this machine when they're already desperate, then they will keep on going back to this machine in an effect to try and solve it when in reality nothing changes. What's the meta here? First, they don't actually fulfill their principled burden. But second, they can't ignore all of Nessie's standing material, that suffering becomes commodified, that poor people by and large get more disadvantage at the point at which this happens. Three things. First, the consensual choices sway against the interests of the poor. Second, why this stalls societal progress into catering to the vulnerable, or if you prefer, why suffering can be valuable and is. Third, why the process of transfer is inherently bad. First, why is there a trade-off? And I want to clarify this. And here, guys, I want to note the lazy response we received from Gov. It is a tool in the toolbox without any regard for what the extents of this world are. We explained clearly from Jello that one, the fact that the poor are perceived as taking this pain for themselves and the fact that it's perceived as their own decision means that even if you take them at their best and say the poor won't opt into it, I don't believe that, it means that the structures and the political will for individuals to want to opt into politicians that vote for this sort of stuff are necessarily limited. But secondly, the state can also just say, as what Jello explains, no, let's just distribute your suffering, because it's about the way up of how they think about how to solve these problems. If it is true that it's that much easier to transfer suffering, as what you explain and what your case literally relies on, then there's no incentive for the state to want to engage in other practices and opt into the other tools for that toolbox. So sure, maybe you explain why it could be a tool, but you don't explain why the government will use other tools in that toolbox when you very clearly explain that there's an incentive to want to do this in the vast majority of instances, and if lots of people opt into it. So there is a clear trade-off. How do they respond to this claim? And I want to note that they had to build that whip to try and explain why the structures get better under their side. They say learned helplessness came from Haduka. Check your notes. No, this came from Mezen. Importantly, the fact that they build hope is unengaging to the reality of this debate, because the claim there is that when you feel hope and are already happy with your life is when you suddenly have the incentive to want to change the world. No, it's things like suffering. If people were happy all the time, then there's no incentive to change the world as it is, insofar as the ways in which they engage with the world are primarily built up from their lived experiences. It's pain and suffering and the ability for rich people to empathize it, which is exactly what Nessie explains. That the fact that rich people can feel guilt from the money that they have, for example, or that other people can feel suffering allows them to empathize with each other and ensure that there's sufficient government impetus in order to be able to solve these things. When they no longer see poor people as having the easy option and them actively choosing to do it, if it is true that it isn't monetized, it's having them seen as the state that allows you to be able to help people in ways that they're unable to. What this means is that there was a trade-off in this debate. And now the weighing becomes, is it better for you to be able to opt into the welfare systems and the systems that inevitably get better under our side? Is it better for you to opt into that world, or one where you just transfer suffering between people? 3 weighing metrics. The first is on sustainability. We simply explain that the source of suffering and the effect and consequence of that suffering doesn't change. I.e., the things that give you stress does not change in the world, perhaps on their side. And importantly, the impacts and the consequences of that suffering doesn't change. Which means if you've had cancer, if something hurts you, that's still going to kill you regardless. What this means is that the true way to help these people in debate isn't by ignoring the ways in which they deal with the suffering, but rather eliminating the source of that suffering and ensuring that it's solved in the first place. But we clearly explain down the bench that that simply doesn't happen in a world that they defend. But secondly, it's about explaining the extent. That is, they aren't deleting suffering, they're transferring it across people. And here they say, well, people will be willing to do this. Oftentimes they aren't, because even if your friends do, what about people that aren't friends? People who are too busy with work, people who are too isolated from the rest of the world that they have to focus on work. Importantly, it's about extent. And if they know that the suffering that you're feeling is also akin to what they have felt before, then obviously it's a way up of their own interest versus your own. They cannot assert, and this is what you have to believe for their case, that all people are willing to take that suffering for you. It's simply out of this debate. I'll take a POI.
Social welfare isn't exclusive, but that's by the framing of your deputy that these structures are hard to change. What exactly is the margin of change on your side if they're so hard to change and solve in the first place?
First, we explain that there's an existing trajectory towards solving this in the first place. You yourself say social movements exist. We explain that there are incentives for governments to cater to this and reduce things like corruption, reduce a lot of the things that we talk about. You know when those structures exist and when that trajectory changes? When they can say, no, just transfer your pain to another person. Transfer it to some other person that could possibly shelter it for you because there's no other alternative. The last thing standing from them then is their principle. And I want to note that they don't even fulfill their principle prerequisite of proving why they reduce suffering. Note they don't delete the suffering, you transfer it, which means that in a utilitarian sense, there's practically no change in the world, which means that the way you weigh in this debate is on explaining where the trajectory gets better. They give one mechanism, which is that people feel hope and therefore are able to leave their learned helplessness. One, this was built from WHIP. Second, it just falls in comparison to the observations that we give about richer people that want to donate and change those structures, the people that have the capacity to want to empathize and actually change the things that make these poor people better. But secondly, we just explained that welfare is better insofar as we reduce the amounts of those things. Even at their worst, we very simply explain that the process of suffering is what allows people to empathize with each other and humanize their experiences in a way that transferring suffering can never do. Rich people will never have to feel suffering a day in their lives. We explain why they're structurally disadvantaged and why they're going to be forced into it for money. But lastly, it's that the process of transfer is inherently bad. No matter what you do, you're consenting to something, and the pain and trauma that is something that you're doing to which you're never going to be able to understand. For all of these reasons, I'm very, very proud to oppose.
All right, thanks for that opposition whip. To close the case for side opposition, calling on opposition reply. Here.
Okay. Hi everyone. I assume I'm audible and visible.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. This government team wants to take the suffering of a rape victim and make 5 other people experience it at random without solving the source of the problem in the first place. Here are 2 reasons why their model can't work. 1, their model relies on people altruistically volunteering to receive this trauma, which they don't prove, but again, why they will consent and why they won't force people, and they explain that they can't. But second, their model assumes perfect incentives of governments. When we explain that politicians are often entrenched in spaces that have strong, profit incentives, which therefore means you can't just assume that governments will be better, because this is about the real world. This is about, with this technology, what therefore incentives will rise. But why do we win, even assuming that their model exists, which is apparently communism in suffering? 1, on improving quality of life. We agree. You as an individual cannot change the things that make you suffer. But the point of the matter is that governments can. And what we explain very clearly from the top is that the point in which you remove this kind of suffering from people is the point in which, 1, governments have far less resources to make changes that can actually stop you from amalgamating more trauma. But two, oftentimes you remove more of the urgency to make change in the first place, because if you believe their framing of urgency, you don't get any actual change. But the second thing to point out is that they have a resource issue. They want this to exist for everyone, but they don't really explain how this will solve the problems of that actually cause trauma. And so what we have to assume is that this will happen over and over again. People will always come back to this as the collective trauma increases, which means that it is unclear at what point governments will be able to stop. It is unclear at what point governments will therefore be able to make some degrees of social change they vaguely explain will exist. But the third thing to point out is that their redistribution mechanism still incrementally increases suffering on net, so you cannot believe it improves quality of life. Because one, they never respond to the push from LO and DLO that this is not problem solving insofar as it removes suffering that exists, but not the sources of it. But again, it on net increases suffering because one, if this works, people will still have to come back and the state will have to redistribute more of the suffering that they'd amalgamated between their first and second visit and still find people to be willing to take more and more of that trauma. But second, their best case is good people suffering more, which we think in principle is already bad enough. But third, their likely case is the poor flocking to these for compensation if people get suffering fatigue. Because for this to be continuous, and as they try to rely on that this will keep happening over and over again, you need to at some point incentivize people to do this because they never really prove why the collective trauma that will be redistributed will inherently lessen. Let's link this to state obligation then. Their best case is not problem solving, but you waste billions on the way. But the collective increase of trauma that accumulates over time means people who don't have to suffer still will, and therefore their happiness and success gets worse. So on state obligation of making people happy, but more importantly on quality of life, they don't actually improve it. But finally, they don't prove why many people will opt to receive that trauma, which means one, the likely case is that only a handful of people would willingly receive this, and therefore all the harms on how this disrupts their lives in work, happiness, and lack of control in what they can receive, therefore makes the harms from LO manifest. And this calls out clearly the continuity issue. If there is no compensation, but they can see that more trauma will still happen, surely this model stops working when there are no more willing volunteers and we are back to ground zero, where people have amalgamated suffering, but the state has wasted millions on it, which means that their best case of many people being willing to receive that suffering therefore relies on our mechanisms that incentivize people to opt in, and therefore the only ability for them to reduce individual trauma received on aggregate relies on our model on opposition, and therefore all of the harms we explain at LO manifest. Why do we therefore win? One, no real response to the incentives for the rich to give back. They only say that there's no urgency to alleviate the suffering, but what we explain is if they can access this, they can remove guilt from being more privileged. So obviously everything about them being willing to change is removed. But finally, exclusivity. Both sides might attempt to have change, but note that we explain the inherent additive trauma of not being equipped to deal with this. And what this therefore means is their best case is probably our worst case, that in status quo, pain relief happens, then suffering accumulates over and over again. At least we stop the worst excesses of these harms actually happening.
All right, thank you for that up reply. To close this round, calling on the dub reply. Here.
Hi. Okay. Audible and visible? Yes?
Yes.
Okay. Three strategic observations. Number one, opposition says we're the utopia, but their counterfactual is literally, let's just save the world, solve the root cause. Like, I'm just unsure what this is. Second strategic observation, opposition has no counterfactual. Look at their case. They are a negative case. Nessie just says it's impossible. Jello just says it's not good towards social justice. And then Sam Tango just says everything came from Mezen. Like, this is just untrue. So if Jello says that this is dirty debating coming from LaSalle, I say this is bad debating coming from Ateneo, because according to the world's manual, in a this House would motion, opposition also needs a counterfactual. So all of you judges need to write down in your notes right now, opposition lost, no counterfactual. Last thing, look at the gaslighting coming from their opposition web speech. They say everything comes from Mezen. Like, I don't know if people are deaf when I speak, pero I literally talked about the literal mechanisms that make us the prerequisite to all of their arguments, the literal preemptions towards their case. So I'm just not sure where Ateneo is winning at this debate. First thing, First path to victory. Is it likely to be done well? Note that this is like the most of the time that Ateneo spends in their speeches. So if we're able to take this down, that means that they can't win. The first thing is that they say that there are a lot of technicalities government doesn't fulfill in terms of world building and all of this stuff, but also that it's just unlikely to be done well. Like it's unpopular, too much money, no real consent. The first thing is that we did respond to these things. Lorraine and I responded to the fact that there is fiat because World's Manual says that government teams have the capacity to say how it will be done. Sure, under our side, we don't have all of the money in the world, but insofar as this motion exists in perpetuity, that means that doing something now is better than doing nothing at their world. But number two, we did say that people are willing to take it. The fact that they know where it's from, the fact that they're your friends, the fact that there's social movements that are able to take this in, but also the fact that under our side, they say, yeah, but the last thing is that they say that technicality, people are going to be depressed when you give them the suffering. Like, no, people, we said in our policy that we're going to do this gradually and safely. Obviously, this motion wouldn't exist if it cannot be done well. But moreover, when Lorraine told you that these are things that people consent to and that there are informed ways to be able to do this, what do we say about this? This is therefore a very uncharitable case coming from opposition bench, but note that this is still worth doing under our side because they never take down the principle and they never take down the instrumental exclusive benefit as to why people suffering needs to be reduced in status quo. But finally, I'm just like, compare. If they say our model is bad, how are we going to adjust to that when they have no model? Their model is literally status quo, so I'm just unsure what that is. Second path to victory. What is exclusive? Government told you that we need to offset birth lottery. How does opposition respond? We need to solve the root cause. And number two, it skirts state responsibility. Number three, they say that we need social change. The first thing I like to point out is that opposition is literally just defending the status quo. They are defending the literal things we said coming from government bench is insufficient. The fact that politicians under their side, if they say that our model can't be implemented well, then under their side, their policies can also be implemented well. There is no delta under opposition, so you cannot buy this case. But also under our side, note that there are things in the world that we can change. Sure, poverty. But there are things that we cannot change. The things that we are born into. We think that for the things that we can change, those are things that are symmetric. Poverty, governments have welfare, all of those things. But what is exclusive under government side is the fact that for the things that you cannot change, the fact that you are born a specific race, the fact that you are depressed from birth, means that these are things that under opposition side, they cannot solve the root cause of. Because what are they gonna do? Like fucking stick a stick up your brain and then remove the depression? I'm unsure how that looks like. Therefore, under our side, what you get exclusively are the people whose suffering is caused by the birth lottery, which is the exact principle that we argued for, an exact reason why this motion still stands. The final thing is just their argument about how this will be used for bad because rich people are guilty. And okay, like, be sad with your Louis Vuitton and Lamborghinis. We think that this is the minimal amount of suffering on the earth. But the most amount of suffering comes from the ones who are impoverished at birth, from the ones who cannot move out of their physical geographical locations. We think for these people, you must provide them recourse, you must provide them a choice, and that choice is one you only get coming from government bench. Very proud to propose.
All right, thank you for that Gov reply. So with that, everyone may now virtually cross the house, and congratulations on the round. For all of the judges, let's hop on over to Discord room 1. Thanks.